stop. Because what if the fairy tale you thought you knew was never the full story? What if the smiling photos, the polished interviews, the carefully delivered words about love and family were only half the picture, and the other half was silence, blocked calls, and relationships slowly iced out behind closed doors? That's exactly what Thomas Markle, Doria Ragland, and Samantha Markle are now saying. And once you hear it laid out, it becomes impossible to unsee.
All out with her mother, Doria Ragland, over just 2 words. Now,
continually make him look like a horrible slob and do everything they could to disparage him. It felt really wrong.
British. And I said, well, that's really nice. And then eventually the third time around, it was like, he's a prince.
Every family has secrets. Every family has tension. But not every family ends up split between a global public narrative and a private reality so different it feels like 2 separate lives running at the same time. Thomas Markle says that's exactly what happened to him. One day, he was the proud father watching his daughter rise. The next, he was dialing a number that stopped picking up. Not once, not twice. For years, he describes it not as a dramatic explosion, not as a screaming match or a bitter fight, but as something colder. Silence. Messages sent into what felt like empty space. Calls that rang and never turned into a voice on the other end. And here's what makes it sting harder. While he was sitting in that silence, the world was watching smiling photos of father and daughter. Watching interviews where gratitude and closeness were spoken about like they were living, breathing things.
The stories would come out. So apparently, according to other journalists, we found out that there were a lot of porcupines.
Thomas says the public image and the private reality didn't match. He insists those warm public moments were choreographed, that what looked spontaneous wasn't, that what looked heartfelt was timed. And imagine what that feels like. To watch millions of people believe you're deeply connected to your own child while you can't even get her on the phone without going through layers of people. He claims it reached a point where speaking to his own daughter required navigating intermediaries. Schedules, permissions, coordination. Think about that. A father who paid for education, who raised her, who knew her before the world had an opinion, suddenly needing clearance to have a conversation. That isn't just distance, that's structure. That's design.
No, not in my last, but I still haven't seen my grandkids.
And here's where it becomes almost too much to process. While Thomas says he was struggling to reach her, the public was hearing speeches about gratitude, about loyalty, about roots. The image was of someone open, authentic, family-oriented. He says that version existed outwardly, but inwardly, it was different, carefully maintained, carefully presented, carefully protected. He doesn't sound explosive when he talks about it. He sounds confused. That's what makes it unsettling. He keeps circling back to the same thing. The person he raised and the person the world sees don't feel like the same person anymore. Not because fame changed her overnight, but because the image became more important than the access. And then there's the detail that sent shockwaves. Samantha claiming Thomas told her Meghan retrieved frozen eggs 9 months before Archie was born. That allegation alone ignited a firestorm, because now it wasn't just about emotional distance. It was about secrets layered under other secrets. It was about timelines, about narratives, about what the public was told versus what the family says they were witnessing from the inside. But if Thomas's pain feels like frustration, Doria's feels quieter. He's the father locked out. She's the mother who stood beside her daughter on the biggest days of her life. The composed presence, the elegant figure in the background of history making moments, the symbol of stability. And yet, according to what's being said, even that bond had shifted into something structured. Doria reportedly described visits that became scheduled like business meetings, calls that had to be arranged, time that had to be booked, a mother booking an appointment to speak to her child. Let that settle. Because that detail reframes every photo people thought showed effortless closeness. She hints that warmth appeared when needed publicly. That connection was visible when cameras were rolling. But once the event ended, once the flashbulbs cooled, the dynamic shifted. Conversations became shorter, access more controlled, presence more strategic. And Doria doesn't paint it with rage. She paints it with something heavier, acceptance mixed with confusion, as if she's trying to understand how the child she raised became someone she sometimes felt like a guest around. Not unwelcome, just managed. Then comes Samantha. And Samantha's account is different. Sharper, more specific. She talks about growing up together, sharing childhood memories, sharing a home. sharing the messy, ordinary moments that don't fit into a polished story. She says the change didn't happen overnight. It was gradual. Invitations less frequent, conversations filtered, interactions routed through others that at some point, even basic communication reportedly stopped being direct. Instead of sister to sister, it became coordinated, structured, managed. And what Samantha describes isn't explosive conflict. It's calculated distance, a shift from organic connection to curated interaction. She claims family moments weren't just occasionally staged, they were thought through, designed to achieve something, evaluated through a lens of how does this look before they ever happened. And once you hear that, you start replaying public appearances in your head differently. The smiles, the brief hugs, the shared glances, were they genuine or were they timed? Samantha goes further. She suggests that even moments between Meghan and Doria weren't immune to this pattern, that appearances were aligned with narrative needs. That closeness was displayed strategically. And whether you believe her or not, the pattern she describes is consistent with what Thomas and Doria are hinting at: distance privately, connection publicly. What's striking is that these three aren't exactly aligned allies. They have different histories, different tensions, different dynamics. A father estranged, a mother publicly present, a sister outspoken, and yet all three describe a similar shift. Access becoming controlled, relationships becoming filtered, image becoming central. They're not saying she became a stranger. They're saying she became strategic. Thomas describes feeling pushed into the role of villain. Doria describes feeling formalized out of intimacy. Samantha describes feeling replaced, not by a person, but by a public-friendly version of herself that only appears when needed. And the pattern they all circle back to is this: the gap between public and private didn't just exist. It was maintained. Think about what that means. Because everyone curates to some degree. Everyone in the public eye manages optics. But when that management extends into family relationships, when calls are rerouted, visits scheduled like corporate meetings, appearances aligned with narrative goals, that's no longer just branding. That's restructuring real human bonds. Thomas says he stopped expecting a callback. Doria learned not to expect spontaneity. Samantha watched her role in the story shrink into something peripheral. 3 different loves, 3 different losses. And at the center of it all is the question no one can answer cleanly. When the public version of your life becomes more protected than the private one, what survives? Because what they're describing isn't loud betrayal, it's quiet replacement. The slow trade of unscripted intimacy for curated presence. The exchange of messy realness for polished consistency. They insist they're not speaking out to destroy. They're speaking out because silence became heavier than controversy. Because watching a global narrative solidify around a version of events that didn't match their lived reality became too much to carry alone. And now the world is left staring at 2 possibilities at once. Either this is the painful unraveling of a family fractured by fame, or it's something more deliberate, something maintained, something managed. And once that question enters the room, it doesn't leave easily. And here's where it gets even more unsettling, because once you accept that there might have been 2 parallel realities running at the same time, you start questioning everything. Not just the big public moments, but the tiny ones, the glances, the body language, the statements that sounded deeply personal. Thomas keeps coming back to the same idea. He wasn't cut off in a dramatic explosion. He was phased out, slowly, carefully, like someone turning down the volume until eventually there's nothing left to hear. He says there were moments he thought things might shift. Moments where he expected the phone to ring, where he believed that whatever distance had formed would correct itself. But instead, what he got was narrative, headlines, carefully worded public statements that seemed to address everything except the private fracture sitting underneath. And imagine watching your own relationship being publicly defined in ways that don't match what you're living. That's not just painful. That's disorienting. Then there's the infamous paparazzi scandal before the wedding. Thomas has admitted he staged photos. He has admitted to mistakes, but he insists that the fallout wasn't proportionate, that instead of a difficult family conversation, the door slammed, the storyline shifted, he became the liability, the embarrassment, the cautionary tale. And he believes that shift wasn't accidental, it was convenient. A clean break framed as consequence. Samantha echoes that theme. She argues that the narrative surrounding Thomas hardened quickly, almost too quickly. That once he was positioned as unreliable, it justified the distance. It made cutting him off look necessary instead of strategic. And whether you agree with her or not, the timing of it all is what keeps people talking. A public scandal erupts, and suddenly the estrangement becomes official. Clean. Final. Understandable from the outside, but what about the inside? Doria's position in all of this is quieter, but no less complicated. She remained publicly close. She attended the wedding. She appeared supportive. She stood as the visual contrast to Thomas's absence. And that's where critics and supporters collide, because some argue that Doria's continued presence disproves the idea of deliberate isolation. Others argue it proves the opposite, that proximity was permitted when it aligned with the narrative and limited when it didn't. There are whispers, too, about how even Doria's role evolved over time. Reports that she was closely involved in the early days after Archie's birth. Then later, notes that she was no longer living nearby. Observations that people around them had taken note. Nothing explosive, just shifts. Subtle ones. And when you're already looking at a pattern of managed closeness, subtle shifts feel louder. Samantha has made some of the boldest claims of all, including questioning timelines and suggesting deeper secrets beneath the surface. Those statements sparked outrage, backlash, legal disputes. But what's interesting is that even when her claims are dismissed by critics as extreme, the emotional through line remains consistent with Thomas and Doria's. Distance that feels intentional, relationships that feel curated. And here's what makes this story different from a typical family feud. Usually, these disputes are loud, public blow-ups, clear fights, direct accusations. This one feels colder, more calculated. It's about access, about gatekeeping, about who gets in and who stays out. Thomas has said repeatedly that he just wanted to speak to his daughter, that he didn't want money, didn't want fame, didn't want revenge, just contact, just acknowledgement. And yet the years passed. Milestones happened, grandchildren were born, interviews aired, and he remained on the outside. Imagine watching your daughter become a global figure while you're learning about her life through television segments like everyone else. Imagine finding out details about your grandchildren the same way strangers do. That's the picture he paints. And it's not explosive anger, it's wounded disbelief. Doria's pain, as described, feels different. It feels like a mother recalibrating, like someone who once had open access and then found that access structured, scheduled, managed. She doesn't publicly rage. She doesn't launch into tirades. But the suggestion that conversations had to be arranged, that spontaneity disappeared, speaks volumes. Samantha, meanwhile, talks about identity, about how Meghan has reportedly said she is no longer a Markle and now identifies as Sussex. For Samantha, that wasn't just a name shift. It felt symbolic, like the shedding of a past, like a deliberate step away from shared history. And that's where this story becomes more philosophical than sensational. Because fame does change people. It restructures priorities. It introduces security concerns, advisors, handlers. It complicates access. Anyone in the public eye can argue that boundaries are necessary. That distance isn't cruelty, it's protection. But the Markles argue that what happened went beyond normal boundary setting. They argue that it became a system, a filter, a mechanism to preserve image, even if it meant sacrificing intimacy. Three different perspectives. One recurring pattern. They describe a woman who can walk into a room and make strangers feel seen, who can articulate vulnerability in interviews, who can connect with millions through a camera lens, and yet, according to them, struggle to extend that same openness to the people who knew her before any of this began. Is that hypocrisy? Or is it survival? That's the question hanging over everything. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the public version of a person is not fake. It's selective. It's curated. It's the best angle, the strongest lighting, the most composed expression. And when someone lives in that version long enough, the private relationships that don't fit neatly into it can feel messy, risky, unpredictable. Thomas says he became unpredictable. Samantha says she became inconvenient. Doria suggests she became formalized. None of them describe a single explosive betrayal. They describe accumulation. Choice after choice, that widened a gap. And once that gap becomes wide enough, pride gets involved. Hurt calcifies. Silence stretches. There's also the reality that public narratives harden quickly. Once a storyline takes hold, estranged father, outspoken sister, dignified daughter, it becomes difficult to undo. The public forms opinions, camps emerge, loyalty becomes polarized. And in that environment, reconciliation becomes more complicated than a simple phone call. Because now it's not just family, it's brand, it's global perception, it's legal risk, it's headlines. And maybe that's the tragedy at the core of all this. Not villain versus victim, not hero versus liar, but a family swallowed by scale. Intimacy crushed under narrative weight. Thomas still says he loves his daughter. Doria, by all accounts, has never publicly attacked her. Samantha, despite the harshness of some of her statements, insists her motivation is truth, not destruction. Whether you believe them or not, their emotional framing is consistent. This isn't about hate. It's about loss of access, loss of spontaneity, loss of the unscripted version of each other. And if there's one detail that lingers after everything else fades, it's that none of them describe her as unrecognizable. They describe her as strategic, as someone who learned to control variables, who understood optics, who chose what the world would see and what it wouldn't. The cost of that control, they argue, was them. So where does that leave us? Staring at a story without a clean ending, no courtroom verdict, no dramatic reunion, no definitive proof that resolves every claim, just competing realities, just emotion layered over narrative. Maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. Maybe fame magnified cracks that already existed. Maybe pride prevented repair. Maybe security protocols and advisors created barriers that hardened into walls.or. Maybe the Markles are right. Maybe what the world saw was a curated chapter while the real story unfolded off camera. Either way, the silence between them remains. And sometimes silence is louder than scandal. Because at the end of all this, beyond the interviews, beyond the allegations, beyond the carefully managed appearances, there are three people describing the same ache, loving someone who feels further away than geography can explain. And once you hear that, it becomes less about royalty or headlines and more about something universal. What happens when ambition and image collide with history? What survives? What doesn't? That's the part no press release can smooth over. That's the part no curated photo can fully hide. And that's why this story refuses to fade. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's unresolved.